this. So welcome everyone to the 6th Disability as Diversity Book Club session. This book club is brought to you by the Docs With Disabilities Initiative in partnership with AHEAD. The initiative uses research, education, and sharing of stories to drive change in healthcare education with an overall aim to build more inclusive educational environments for trainees with disabilities and increase representation of disabled providers in the healthcare workforce. The goal of the Disability as Diversity Book Club is to introduce varied perspectives and encourage empathy for all stakeholders in a health science setting. Together, we will work through multiple cases, empowering DRPs with varied perspectives and resources that boost your confidence to work through complex situations. Today's session will be recorded. At the end of the case debrief, there will be time for a Q&A, at which point we will end the recording to encourage further discussion. And we really encourage you to participate. We're all here to learn from one another. So welcome, everyone. We're really excited. Catherine Moore and myself. The moderators today, so I'm Suzanne Hawks, Disability and Learning Assistance Specialist at Wake Forest University School of Medicine in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And now I'll let my amazing partner, Dr. Lisa Meeks, introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa, and I'm an associate professor at the University of Michigan Medical School and executive director of the Docs With Disabilities Initiative. And this is my favorite thing to do all week. On my calendar. This is it.
And thank you to all of the contributing authors to this book, because if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to be here today. We really thank them for their work, their time, their commitment, but especially to Leslie Neal Boylan and Lisa M. Meeks for their time and editing of pulling this book together. Okay, so just some reminders for today. This space is for learning and connecting. So no one has all the answers, not even Lisa or myself, and questions are welcome at all levels. So feel free to participate however you feel comfortable. And remember to be mindful of your contribution time to ensure opportunities for others to share and connect. This isn't a space for individual or group consultation regarding current student situations at your school, although there will be a brief Q&A at the end, hopefully where we can talk more broadly about issues. And we're just asking everyone to remember to navigate this space with humility and respect. To engage in the discussion, there'll be two ways to do that. You can use the Q&A feature, and we ask you to use that instead of the chat feature because it allows us to keep track of what questions we've gotten to and what we haven't yet. And if you don't want to use that, or if you want to speak, just raise your hand and we'll be able to unmute you and lower your hand and you'll be able to speak. We really, really welcome discussion here. So to give you an idea of how things will go, we'll start with the key points of the case history. Just to review real quick, give you a refresher, especially if it's been a minute since you've reviewed this particular case. And then we're going to go over perspectives of the student, the medical school, and as well as the disability resource provider. And then there's some guided questions we'll go through to actually work through the case with you, which is focusing on if this was your student, how would you support the student? How would you work through these? What would your suggestions be? And then at the end, as I said, we'll leave it open for some more open-ended questions on the topic of ways to support students with chronic health conditions, for example. Okay, so I will hand it off to Dr. Lisa Meeks here to talk about the key points of the case.
Great, thanks. All right, everybody. Mark is a fourth-year student, and he was just diagnosed with colon cancer. He is academically doing well and appears to be a competitive candidate for the match. He's planning on applying to general surgery for residency. So it's pretty competitive. He needs to bring his AA+++ game. He's scheduled for a sub-internship. Now, sub-internship is where you're acting as an intern, and many times it's a tryout session of sorts in a surgical oncology rotation. So it's very specific to his area that he wants to go into. He needs to get letters of recommendation and really good evaluations in this very short period of time. It's usually about 2 weeks. He will have significant absences, however, from his rotations as he needs to see doctors, undergo surgery, and begin chemotherapy. With assistance from his faculty advisor and DRP, he had, let's imagine he had a great DRP at the medical school. He's able to obtain a schedule change to be more flexible on this rotation and to do preoperative assessment clinic. Mark is uncertain about how to disclose his need for accommodation to his new program director, where he will soon start residency. So he's very concerned. He's kind of pre-applying and not sure how he will go about navigating the next few months. And then really he'll continue to need care into his first year of residency or his intern year.
Okay, so the perspective of the student. So the student may not be aware of disability resources since they didn't need these resources until their fourth year of medical school. So they don't know if accommodations exist in graduate medical education. There's pressure to continue the original plan of completing acting internships with 30-day interviews and applying for residency on time. There's a fear that interviews on the recruitment committees will notice hair loss from chemotherapy, which could hurt his chances of matching in general surgery. There's a concern interviewing across the country while receiving chemotherapy will make them more prone to acquire community illnesses like flu or cold, etc. The cost of healthcare and treatments when living on student loans, less invasive surgery or not as aggressive chemotherapy, which may allow Mark to miss less coursework and stay on track. He desires privacy, which so many students do, sounds completely reasonable to me, and disclosing to the program director and not obtaining accommodations is a fear. Uncertain how disability is handled when he enters residency as a resident in training and an employee.
All right, so the perspective of the medical school. They're not certain, they're concerned about how side effects of chemotherapy are going to impact his performance on clinical rotations. And because he's such a good candidate, they're worried about whether this is going to impact his ability to get the required letters of recommendation needed to be competitive for that surgical specialty. They're concerned about the safety of the student as they may treat patients with infectious diseases. And when you undergo chemotherapy, you become immunosuppressed. So they have concerns about the student's health. They are also concerned about how to situate this in something called the MSPE, or the Dean's Letter. This is the letter from the school that is kind of a summary of the student's presentation and performance in medical school. And so they're wondering, should we disclose this in the MSPE? Should we say something so that the residency program knows that this person will be undergoing treatment? And in kind of parallel to that, the student submits what's called a personal statement on their application for residency. And so if something is going to get disclosed in the MSPE, you need to have triangulation with what the student is saying in their personal statement. But if they do this, is this going to impact his ability to match into surgery? And then will Mark receive support and flexibility in residency? I know many of you probably have the same questions, right? You're becoming experts in UME, but then your students are leaving the nest and going on to a myriad of different types of training programs. And it can be really hard to support them in that transition because there's so much that's unknown. So we'll talk a little bit about that today.
So for the perspective of the DRP, there was concern about lack of flexibility regarding last-minute rotation change, learning and retaining information while dealing with side effects from treatment. We all know that, even learning and retaining information when you're just not feeling good is one thing, but when you're dealing with chemo and really intense care for yourself, that takes quite the mental load. And are accommodations available for residency, and how does the student request these accommodations?
All right. So the perspectives of the program director, and the program director is the person who oversees the residency training. So from a program director perspective, if you're accepting or interviewing a student with a disability, you might have questions like, what accommodations would need to be in place and how will this impact schedules? Scheduling is a huge thing because residents are also serving as providers. And so they need to have a certain amount of coverage. They're trainees and providers. They're uncertain about the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act and how that might work on a new employee. In other words, can you have your residency position held if this person wanted to take some time off? The adequacy of the financial coverage. So in residency, the residency program is paying for that resident. So with that money, if the resident isn't there and needs to come in another year, will they be able to hold those funds? Will they not have coverage for that person if they need to extend their residency? When they come in, they're only covered for 3 or 4 years or 6 years or however long the residency program is. So will there be adequate financial coverage? And could this person have long-term disability insurance if needed? The ability of the resident to manage the transition to residency on top of everything else they're going through with their treatment regimen. And then concerned about the boundary between being a supervisor, evaluating the resident's performance, and providing enough emotional support. I will tell you, most program directors would probably be very, very nervous. Intern year is your hardest year. And if someone is going through cancer treatment, that would be a pretty tough thing to balance.
So we're starting the process here. So what do you know? What do you need to know? And how and where might you find new information that may lead to enhanced access? So I try to open my mind up here to just what do I know about, basic human needs? Then what do I know about basic human needs for a medical student? What do I know about, the needs of the program, the technical standards, all that fun stuff? Would you add anything to that, Lisa?
So I think you're definitely going to need to know a few things about the residency program. One, you're going to want to know the size of the program, and if your learner is really looking to go ahead and match and start the program, they're probably going to be wanting to look for a larger surgery residency as far as like the number of people in the residency, because if they go into a surgical residency that has 5 or 10 learners, there's probably no way to do it and miss time. Remember, these people are also operating as the providers. So coverage is a huge issue. So I would want to be looking at, how big is the residency program that they're going into? The other thing I would want to think about is, what are the essential functions of the job when you're doing surgery? And can this person legitimately go in and do all of those required areas? Now, many people will do a year of medicine. So a year of internal medicine is kind of the foundation for the rest of the residency. And so they may not be doing as much surgery in the first year, and that may be helpful when they wouldn't have the stamina, perhaps, if they're a person that's undergoing chemotherapy. The other thing I would want to know is, what kind of chemotherapy? Is it targeted? What kind of radiation, if that's appropriate? Chemotherapy and radiation have come a long way. And so it may be that it's minimally invasive and there are a few side effects. You don't want to know all of the facts up to the point of being a clinician, but you really want to understand how this is going to impact the learner so that you can help them make an informed decision.
So question 1, and this is where we really welcome discussion. Please feel free again to participate with the Q&A, and we can unmute you if you raise your hand. And I need to move my window around so I can read things, so sorry about moving things. But in assessing Mark's case, would disability and disability services come up as a potential resource for the student at your institution? Why or why not? So would disability and disability services come up as a potential resource for the student at your institution? Why or why not?
And I just put a resource from our DIGME group, our DIGME group, which Nicole Taylor, the author of this case, was co-chair before she retired. And it's just a little helpful handout to give you some resources for that GME space. And feel free to, while you're thinking about the answers to this question, also feel free to go back if you've thought of more things that you would need to know and where you would go to get them. Feel free to add those in as well. So let's break that chat barrier. Who's willing to raise their hand and say something or type something in the chat?
Lisa and I are both comfortable with silence, so we'll wait.
But we also love being cheerleaders for you.
I see a raised hand.
I'm sorry?
Hold on, I saw a raised hand, but I can't find how to do it.
Joe Murray. Yay. I'm going to allow you to talk. I get a little excited about Joe Murray. I've gotten to see Joe Murray in person last week, and I get to see him this next coming week. So Joe Murray's my buddy. What do you think, Dr. Murray? You're allowed to talk. No, did we lose him? Dida? Oh, we can't hear you, Joe. No.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yay!
Oh, good. Sorry about that.
We're all going to learn from your brilliance.
Oh, well, thanks. I was going to say I logged on today because I was in Lisa Meek's withdrawal. So I'm in the middle of clinic, but I logged in a little bit late on this case. So I missed a little bit of the beginning. But one thing, as I heard you talking maybe for the last 10 minutes or so, is just one thing I might do is it sounds like maybe dividing this up into a few different parts. One is, how do we think about accommodating Mark in sub-internships, whether it's a local one or thinking about away sub-internships? I think that's the position he's in now. Is that it?
He's in sub-internship for surgery. He's matching in surgery, but he just got diagnosed with colon cancer, and he's going to have to undergo surgery and either chemo or radiation.
Got it. So one thing to do is to think about sort of just first how to kind of help him get through the sub-internship. And if he's thinking about doing away sub-internships, a separate thing is to think about kind of where the cancer treatment and accommodations fits in to the longer term prospects and timing of matching, and maybe potentially thinking about taking time off until there's some clarity as to kind of where his cancer is, how he's functioning with even accommodations with his whatever kind of treatments he's getting. So I might sort of differentiate those two and focus more just on kind of how to help accommodate him first in his current sub-internship. And doing a sub-internship locally in many at your main institution is kind of, in many ways, the best way to do it, because those are people who've worked with your disabilities office, who are probably familiar with surgical rotation accommodations and can figure it out. And you're right, sub-internships are a weird hybrid because residency people are involved in them, but they're still usually under the purview of kind of the undergraduate medical education department of surgery. So I think, using in a way his local sub-internship as kind of a test run to sort of see how he does, and then to maybe that can bring some knowledge to, if he does do an away sub-internship, an audition elective, so to speak, what things you might have learned from there. You might be able to incorporate what you've learned here to there.
Absolutely. And I would say I definitely would be thinking about, this intern years is really, really tough. And I would definitely be thinking about whether it's a good idea to do it. What I'm wondering, Joe, is I would probably, and this is uninformed, right? This is just my opinion. I would obviously be talking to deans and other people to get their opinion on this. But I wonder if it would be a good idea to go through the match. And then once you match, ask for an extension. to start in a second year so that they can undergo treatment. I'm just wondering, because the match is so competitive and because taking a year off might make them less competitive, I don't know. That might just be an assumption I have.
Yeah, it is a good point. I mean, I think in general, so one thing is with cancer treatment, typically you kind of want to do it sooner rather than later. So deferring treatment for
not deferring treatment, deferring the residency after
deferring the residency. Yeah. I don't know all the logistics about can you match and then immediately say I need to take a year off.
Yeah.
And that does put the program in a tough spot. So I don't know the legalities of that. You remember the match is a contract. You've agreed to participate in this crazy system and you're going to go to the place that accepts you. You've already signed a contract. You've assigned an agreement to participate in the match beforehand.
Right.
So I think, I would just want to understand the logistics more about that. But yeah, I think if that's doable to match and then take time off to kind of get the treatment, one of the challenges there is it's that the student may be in a bit of a limbo without some kind of disability insurance. In other words, they're probably at that point unemployed, not working, because I don't think they would be working at the institution if they're taking a year off, and they're no longer a student maybe. So I'd also want to just understand my own local logistics of, is it better to sort of as a student get treatment and maybe take the time off and then match afterwards?
Yeah.
I think that's what makes this case so interesting though, because this is something where, I mean, many of the cases you could say the same thing, but this could happen to anyone at any time, and that's like remembering that we have human bodies and that these are human beings that could have a complicated health need at any time is what makes this so interesting.
And we do know people get sick. I mean, I can't tell you, I have had at least one handful, so 5 students over 20 years in medicine that were diagnosed with cancer while in medical school. So this isn't unusual, right? And what would we do if they were diagnosed in residency? Would their residency position be held? And while the finances of it are complicated, I do think we have to be thinking about the learner's health, but also thinking a little bit of strategy. One of the things that's so great about having partners like Joe and getting to know different residency programs and just having partners, as Joe mentioned, having partners in your own institution who are program directors, right, of a residency. Every single one of you likely has this, is to be able to use those people as a source of support and information, to ask them how would you feel about a learner matching and then going off and getting treatment? What would that look like for you? How do we situate this best for the learner? And they'll be able to really help. We have another GME person who had their hand raised. I've given you permission to talk. Miss Leland.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Okay, I wasn't sure if you were talking about me. Okay, I was thinking about a lot of the things that have been mentioned that we don't know how he's going to react to the treatment. It's from the information we have, we don't know how long the treatment will be. And so I think it's a time to talk about options, but not a time yet to put in place a plan, because we still need some information. So there's still a lot of missing information.
Yeah.
The summary mentioned perhaps a year of research. That might be a good option for him. Because he can still stay in the program, stay in the UME program, do a year of research, take care of his health, get healthy, and then move on to residency.
I love that. And I hadn't thought of that. through editing the case, through talking to Nicole and Suzanne about the case. That's never something that I thought of. But adding in something like a research year or an MPH, or a lot of the one-year programs are MED programs, medical education certificates, things like that, would allow him to remain a good candidate, do something, keep that coverage that Dr. Murray was talking about, that health insurance coverage, not lose touch, right? Remain pretty proximal to the work and still be a really good candidate. I love that idea. And this is why everyone should be contributing, because we, together we just come up with such good ideas. This is a really good idea that now I want to go back to the publisher and say, can we add this? But great work.
And we have another raised hand, but now I can't find it.
Yay!
Where'd it go?
I don't see another raised
Christine,
hand.
can you help me? Maybe there it goes. No other raised hands, okay.
Any other
Okay.
thoughts? I don't even think we answered the question, actually. We got kind of off. I think we went a little sideways. That never happens with me.
Bringing it back. We're bringing it back.
Okay. So I think, the hard thing about would disability and disability services come up is that there is still this misunderstanding, right? That this is employment and you were in education, it doesn't count in employment, when in fact the ADA absolutely covers an employment. And indeed, the majority of the accommodation ideas that we have and the ways in which we know kind of what the ceiling is on reasonable accommodation is through the EEOC. So it's through that employment pathway that we get a lot of our information about employment, and certainly this would apply to GME. The problem is that GME is a Wild West right now, and just figuring out who's on first is kind of a part-time job for depending on your institution. So you could be talking about occupational health, you could be talking about HR, you could be talking about a disability office, but you have no idea who's in charge. So there is a mandate from the ACGME, who is the organization that accredits graduate medical education. So you have to be an accredited program to operate, but to, so they do have this oversight, and they do say you have to have a disability policy. Unfortunately, we know in the research that about 40% of training programs don't comply with that requirement. So a learner may actually be kind of in this very gray, nebulous space with regard to where they go next and what happens next. It could very, very easily be a black box, not only for them, but for you. One of the ways that I know I worked with my learners was to situate them in that GME space. If they had, their top 3 rankings, I would actually call the institutions and do a lot of the investigation myself and get a sense of what was available. But certainly your learner can do that as well, can kind of cold call and just say, hey, I'm looking for information about disability, but it may not come up. People may not connect cancer as a disability. And in fact, in many cases, it might, it could take a little while for it to be considered a disability, right? That 6-month period. So, and we don't know. I mean, I think, a good point was brought up that we don't know what the effects are going to be. So I don't think that people, especially if a dean of students is handling this or somebody of that nature, I'm not sure that they would connect this to disability resources, especially since this person wasn't a consumer of the service for the majority of the UME space. So that may be a potential barrier, right? Not even thinking about disability.
And I think you brought up a good point, Lisa, about calling, and how I think that's part of the reason why you know so much about so much, because you're not afraid to call and you're not afraid to ask the questions.
No.
And when you do that too, it helps make those connections so that it would make it easier for someone to be connected with disability services as a resource because you've already done some of that work behind the scenes.
Yeah. And you can get a sense of what is this institution like? Is this a good move for this person? Or you can back up, like what was suggested, take a year, do the treatment, come up with some sort of hybrid way for the person to stay connected, and start calling around and seeing, you know, what is a good fit, because the person still, even after surgery and initial treatment, they may still require follow-up and more treatment. So definitely.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go to question 2. So, do faculty advisors work collectively with a DRP when a student discloses an issue regarding accommodation? If a student discloses a new diagnosis to a clerkship director or a faculty member, are these individuals aware of the DRP services to bring them into the conversations as a valuable resource? And I think that we sort of highlighted that a little bit, but going back to just making your connections and getting your name known so that you can be brought into the conversation. But I'd really be curious if anyone else had a thought about that.
I'd love to see a show of hands, since we have the hand option, like a show of hands of how many people believe they would be brought into that conversation.
1, 2, 3.
Only 3 people.
3.
That's so interesting.
4. No, 3. It went
3.
to 4, then it went to 3.
They
were like, yes, no.
No. And we have this issue as well with mental health, right? Mental health crises, not thinking about disability services, just getting them situated with counseling and other things, but not connecting this to disability services. So interesting. 3. For any of the 3 that raise their hands, does anybody want to share how this normally occurs or have an example of how this might occur?
We have a raised hand.
Hello, this is Dina again. I meet regularly twice a month with scheduled meetings with the Dean of Student Affairs. And when needed, the clerkship directors are brought in, or anyone else is brought in. If there are students that are being referred to the DRC, or if they have questions about a student, if they should refer a student. Those regularly scheduled meetings help with getting to know the faculty and getting a good working relationship so they understand your role and you understand their role, and they begin to understand what kind of what it might look like in a student when they need or should be referred to a DRP. So that collaborative relationship is very important to meeting the needs of the students.
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the things that you said, you didn't say it directly, but one of the things that I want to point out about the way that you do it is you are meeting people when there may not be anything going wrong, right? Or there may not be any crisis. You're meeting people and becoming part of the natural conversation. And so that when something does come up, you have a pre-existing relationship, no matter how minor that relationship is. They know who you are and you know who they are. And so that facilitates, you know, the discussion for sure. Okay, Brandy, allow to talk.
Yeah, we just had this happen this week. So we have a student who is a 3rd year on surgery right now, who was just diagnosed, actually just had her chemo port put in yesterday or the day before. So brand new diagnosis, brand new, you know, big news, and is on surgery right now. So is obviously worried about the hours that are going to need to be missed and have already been missed with all of the specialist appointments that have come out of nowhere. But everyone, all of the coordinators in our ClinEd department immediately sent the student to me. I've already had a meeting with the program director. We're waiting to get more info from the student and her providers on what will the treatment look like, of course, what will the chemo look like. Right now, they don't think radiation, or surgery at this point. So can we just work within the current absence policy, or are we going to have to kind of start looking for creative solutions? But anytime anything like this is happening, they always bring me in. We have really good relationships, fortunately, where they always lean on me as a resource to try to find solutions.
That's amazing.
Mhm.
And, thank you for sharing, because I do think people sometimes read these cases and think, oh, that'll never happen, or there won't be that complication. All of these cases happened. So let's just start there. Every single one of these cases is an actual case. This happened. And this is not unusual. And I don't know if it's because they're medical students and so they're more aware of symptoms, or if they're, I know sometimes in DO programs, they're doing more kind of physicals on one another. So if they're feeling something that's not normative, and they're getting diagnosed quicker. But this happens more than you would think. It really does. So thank you so much for contributing.
Mhm. What advice do disability services provide to prepare the student for the transition from medical school to graduate medical education, where the student will become a resident in training and an employee?
So what do you think, everybody? Are you currently counseling your students as they complete fourth year and go on to residency? Or are you leaving it kind of, that's for them to engage at the GME level? Let's share ideas and resources.
I know for me, I have some students that are like, I got this, I can do it. And then some students that I think do need a little bit more support, even just to look through websites together. And that's sometimes the beauty of Zoom, where you can just share screen, look at some websites, see what feels good, see what feels welcoming, see if there's anything like really clear that you can find quickly. Sometimes, when you have to dig and dig and dig, that's a sign.
Right? Or if you call and they can't tell you anything, like they don't know literally who does something. And so they may have to advocate more. So I think even going in knowing what needs to be done is helpful, and helping empower them with, you could even do role playing to help them help empower them about what to say. You could share the communication guide out of the book. Not this book, but the Equal Access book. The other thing that I really have started to promote now that we have a critical mass of podcast episodes is, if you go to our podcast, I wish we could change it, but we can't. It's almost imperceptible. The little box at the top that says search, but it's above like the last episode of the podcast. And you can put any search term in there. So it could be specialty, it could be type of disability, and you can find episodes where people that are in residency training or in practice have talked about their residency training experience. I have received more emails from medical students saying, thank you so much. This was so helpful. I got to understand what I'm facing, as I enter residency. And then many of those individuals, if they're willing to be on the podcast, a lot of times they're willing to talk to people. So you could also email them and say, I have a student that I'd love to connect with you. I do a lot of connections. In fact, after we get off today's call, I've got to put two people together, somebody getting ready to go through the match process and wants to be connected to a wheelchair user that is in residency, has completed a good majority of their residency. So the good news is I can connect them with several people, but you have access to that same thing. We made that search bar there for a reason so that anybody could search by exactly what they're looking for. And by the way, this also cuts across identities. So if you're looking for somebody that's part of the LGBTQ plus community, if you're looking for somebody that is Black, if you're looking for a woman, you can put all search terms in there and it will pop up. We use BIPOC, I think, is our search term. So you would want to use that. But yeah, lots of ways to search that resource.
That is so cool.
And then Pete Poulos at Stanford has a mentorship program where it's people all over the country. So your student can get involved in that and be paired with somebody in the same specialty. And that's also really helpful.
That's awesome.
So what other things do you do to help prepare your students? I just gave you the new DIGME handout in the chat. Hopefully all of you got it. And I need to make sure that goes through the accessibility people and gets formatted before we put it on our website, but it'll be on there soon. So what other types of things do you guys do? So somebody said, they wanted to go through it themselves and see what the process would be like. One of the things I would encourage you to do is just don't not say anything or don't do nothing, because so many learners, I get called to consult on a lot of legal cases, and when they're GME cases, it is 99.99999% learners that chose not to disclose and try. And it's never a good idea in residency, because although I completely respect people's autonomy to choose whether they disclose, once you are in a situation where there's a problem, it's only going to get worse in residency. And I can tell you, residency directors don't have a lot of empathy for people who come in knowing that they have a disability, knowing they need accommodations, and not asking for them. In fact, our research shows, when Suzanne takes over, I'll post in the chat, one of our latest research papers shows that for trainees, so residents that have accommodations, there are no differences in depressive rates and no differences in medical errors. But when residents do not have accommodations and need them, they are significantly more likely to have an increase in depressive symptoms, and they are significantly more likely to have medical errors. So the consequences are pretty big in residency. And if you think medical school is hard, residency is medical school on steroids. Like, it's so, well, intern year is as well. So it's tough.
Okay. Moving forward, unless anyone has anything else here. Question 4. How could the program director, designated institutional official, and/or human resources improve the culture for the student to feel comfortable disclosing a disability and/or need of accommodations during several key times throughout the matching process? So I'll say it again. How could the program director, designated institutional official, and/or human resources improve the culture for the student to feel comfortable disclosing a disability and/or need of accommodations during several key times throughout the matching process?
Yeah, we could have probably improved on that question. We didn't have an editor when this, I mean, we had the editors at the publishing house, but we didn't have a good editor for more direct questions. But essentially, what can residency programs do to make people feel comfortable? And at what points in the process, in the match process?
I think sort of like what I said before is like just putting some things on your website for the first thing, because that's usually what people will do first, just when they got some time, they're looking around at what are my options. Oh, let's see what this website is. And, there might be like a quote or, an easy button that, was found relatively quickly, that can make a big difference.
I'm going to put a couple of articles, they're all free access, into the chat. The first one that I put in just a second ago was that one about medical errors and increased depressive symptoms. And then I'm going to put some right now in the chat that recount kind of the basic tenets of improving inclusion, including something called welcoming language. And so there are some examples here that that people can use. Oh, I did that wrong. Hold on.
And I see in the chat, Kara James said, we have worked closely with our school leaders to incorporate accessibility statements in many places like websites, all communications, etc.
Great.
Dr. Murray, you got it.
Mute. How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So, I've been thinking about how much progress DRPs have made in the past few years about making themselves known on campuses. And I reflect on this by going to, some of our symposia over the years and just getting to talk to more people and sort of learning how, a DRP in a health sciences program often has some information about disability and accommodations on the admissions website, has some access at orientations, sometimes has some access and sends out things around transitions within medical school or whatever health sciences program they are. And in a way, I wish program directors, so now into GME, program directors, DIOs, who sort of oversee residency at hospitals and human resources, kind of picked up on some of the things that I think a lot of our disability resource professionals do so well in undergraduate medical education and in other health sciences education, which is getting stuff on the websites for residency, for the match, getting information about disabilities and accommodations, being available and presenting during orientation, having paperwork go out post-match but pre-starting residency, the similar paperwork about having to fill out forms for your IDs and choosing your health insurance, if there's stuff about disability and accommodations and what's available and who to contact, sort of modeling in a way or taking from the models that I think many of our DRPs have done in their own institutions. If hospitals, program directors, DIOs did that, I think it would be a lot better.
Thank you. We have Grace Clifford. She is allowed to talk. Grace.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks. So I think for this, I'm also thinking about the culture piece of it and how, DRPs, it might not be their lane per se to talk about accommodations in the GME space, but you can also kind of support the group that are making those determinations. So one thing I try to do is make myself really available to the clinical sites, to the clinical site directors. So if I've had a couple individuals reach out and say, hey, we have a hard of hearing resident coming in. Can I chat with you about what's possible? What do we need to think about? And those are the conversations I want to encourage, because then, when our students make that transition, whether they end up back at UCLA or not, we're creating and extending that culture of inclusion for individuals with disabilities. So I know the processes for the GME space can be just a lot more difficult to navigate. Their caseloads are higher and they might not be as informed. So I think some of it from a DRP perspective is how can we partner and be a resource to these individuals and to encourage the yes, we can do this kind of mindset as well.
Thank you, Grace. I just muted myself because it just started thundering, so bear with me here. All right, question 5. What are some additional resources that I can learn more about assisting a student who has recently been diagnosed with a disability or would benefit from being involved with a community involved in disability in the medical health sciences? I mean, my personal resource is just Lisa Meeks, but that's just me. Kidding, but not. Docs with
Really?
Disabilities, Grace? Is that what DWD in the chat is? Yep.
I think, we have so many programs. Most people don't even know about all the programs in the Docs with Disabilities umbrella, but I'm sitting here looking at the physical book. Please note this is available in most of your libraries. And what strikes me is, we answer all of these questions in the back of the case, if you haven't figured that out yet. And there are a lot of resources and a lot of explanation given here about the differences between UME and GME and the things that you would need to know, more than I remember having. So there's a lot in here. If you want to go into the book, I certainly advise you and encourage you to do that. It talks in the summary, which is kind of like our advice to you. It talks about a team approach that it's critical to make sure that all faculty are aware of all of the resources and can point the student to you, because you would definitely be a main source of assistance. And the timing of disclosure, it talks about that being important, and the human resource office at the matched institution. So it's interesting that the terminology it's using in this chapter, and again, we have our own Suzanne Hawks who helped write the chapter, but I really appreciate that one of the things that it says in that summary is, a DRP's job in this transition is to demystify the process, to take that black box and unlock it so the student can understand. Now, again, it's not going to be the same across each program or each institution. You're going to have to do a little bit of work, but if you understand that it could be X, Y, or Z, right, then 50% more than your learner knows. They don't know anything. And they're, knee deep in all of their 4th year stuff and interviews. Ideally, you're working with them a little bit in 3rd year too, to get ready for the match process, but definitely go to the recommendations and the resources that are outlined here. The other big resource I would say is DIGME, Disability in Graduate Medical Education. That's under the Docs with Disabilities Initiative. And I will put that link here in the chat, but it is specific to GME. And so all of the resources, there's one-pagers, there's handouts, there's videos. These videos are a great resource to add to you can take any of our videos, they're all on YouTube. You can redirect them to your website. We encourage you to do that and to say, here's a video about the transition from UME to GME. And it explains to the learner in a very simple way what's happening. So, that's a really excellent resource as well. And students who've gone through residency. So get to know your students. Like, this is why I say 1 to 85. First of all, as the ratio for it, it's so much work when you do it the right way and you're able to kind of provide that wraparound and transition support, but also you really get to know your learners. I still have from UCSF, just last week, I got 2 emails from people finishing residency who want to do disability inclusion work. They're going into faculty roles, and they're amazing. My students were amazing, and you develop a really tight relationship with them. And, I'm working with people that were my students. That's how old I am. I am working with people who matriculated into medical school and are now on faculty. So that's like 8 years of knowing these learners. Get to know your learners. They're amazing. MSDCI came up. That's great.
Yeah, the
AMFL,
chat's
I
lighting up.
love AMFL. Love it, love
Yeah.
it, love it.
Same. You should have seen, I introduced the AMFL to a student, and the way their face lit up when they saw that, because they just didn't feel alone anymore, was really, really special.
Great.
I really loved the
It really
activity
makes
in
a
the
huge
chat.
difference. I was on a training last week with a deaf internist who had just been introduced to AMFL when they went into residency. Had no idea about, I don't know where they went to medical school, but no idea about amplified stethoscopes, no idea about pocket talkers, no idea about any of these things. And I thought, this is why we're so dedicated to training DRPs, because what is, for you, may seem like a very little thing, but it makes or breaks the educational experience of your learner.
Even just for someone to hear that you're supporting them, and to feel that support and feel like I had a meeting with a prospective student last week where they just appreciated that I knew what they were talking about, and I understood the terminology they were using. I mean, I think that kind of comfort makes a huge difference. And you can learn so much more of that on these resources.
Yeah. The EEOC is a great place to go too. The other one is the JAN network.
Mm-hmm.
And if you ask a question, they'll tell you about reasonable accommodations in clinical settings. I used JAN all the time as I was building kind of my repertoire of, do's and don'ts. I'll see if I can put a chapter in here and just give you a little chapter that has a lot of accommodations listed in it. I had it up this morning for somebody else, so it might be easy to find. Don't tell the publisher. He's in trouble. But we can go ahead and go on to the next question.
Okay. So question 6, what are the requirements of graduate medical education to provide accommodations once a student matriculates to residency?
This feels like a test question.
It does.
And you are not allowed to get off of Zoom until you know the answer. Anybody want to take a stab at explaining Title I of the ADA and reasonable accommodation?
Oh, we have a raised
yay.
hand. Dina, you're the best.
Yeah.
Okay. Oops. Did I do the right one? Yeah.
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, I won't say I'm explaining ADA in Title I, but I will explain the answer to the question. So they are required to provide reasonable accommodations as they would to any employee, because they are both employees and students. So here we work with them both as students and as employees. So EEO will handle employee questions, and those are things that would relate to making changes or accommodations to the contract and their employment obligations. The DRC would provide things that would not make any changes to that, such as, maybe needing to use an EMR system that is in a quieter environment, something like that. So they really need to look at residents from both sides, as students and employees, and make sure that reasonable accommodations are put in place, making sure, as always, that patient safety comes first. And oftentimes that means needing to become a bit creative with providing those reasonable accommodations.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's treated differently by some and this is always a gray space, right? And I will tell you, unfortunately, it's a hot potato. And I know that some of you probably have already gone through this, which is it's, GME doesn't want it, so that they'll lean into the learner role. And UME is like, you know, we're tasked and they're your employee. And so they lean into the HR role. And unfortunately, our learner, our trainee winds up in the middle of all of that sometimes. So I think, you know, in more cases than not, it's going to be that employee role with some consideration for the fact that they're still learning. And I like to talk about the developmental process, right? That they might need more support in intern year than they will need moving forward. Whereas if you're an employee and you're being hired, there's the essential functions of the job and you have to be able to complete them. But because they are a learner, as you were saying, Dina, they may not be able to complete all of the elements of all of the jobs. So I will encourage HR to use the milestones that are part of the ACGME, kind of where a learner should be in their learning process, and use those to scaffold the idea of accommodations, if that makes sense.
I'll let you catch up in the chat here, Lisa, but I'll read that Dina just added. It is important to note that GME and UME are very different, and some accommodations are appropriate in UME that are not appropriate in GME. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. But also, I always play the devil's advocate, but also ACGME requires you to create a healthy work environment where things like leaving for an appointment may not be considered a reasonable accommodation, but it's part of what you have to do for every resident anyway. And I think they specifically talk about dental appointments, medical appointments, health appointments. So overnight call is a really good example of something that might not be appropriate in GME that is in UME, but there are ways to navigate that. And the more informed you are, the more you can inform your learner, who then can make decisions about not only their specialty and what specialty is right for them. Like if you need release from overnight call, you definitely don't want to be an OBGYN, right? That's just, that's not your life path. Because the sleep is highly disrupted. EDs, you know, if you want to be an emergency room physician, you are doing shift work, so your sleep is disrupted. So you want to think about specialties where you don't have as much sleep disruption, and you want to think about going into a larger residency where, you know, your inability to do nights doesn't completely collapse the program and their ability to provide coverage. So it's, you know, there are layers of learning that happen, and all of these things will help you. And I'm sure all of that's in this chapter. If not in that chapter, definitely in the book. All of it will help you be a better source of information and support for your learner. I'm not going to talk about any legal cases. There are very few, I will say that. There are 4 that I am aware of and aware of the facts of the case, but they're so nuanced, and the contract law is so different at the GME level that I don't think it's worth a lot of evaluation for this level of discussion. But what I can say is 2 of those cases are on the form that I gave you. And so, you know, those cases, I use those cases as teaching cases. The Jabowski case, I really use a lot to just really highlight that asking for an accommodation in retrospect is not going to help you. Like, you need to do it in advance. And if you miss that boat and you have performance issues, you can have your contract revoked, or you can have it not renewed.
Okay. What are the legal requirements of GME to ensure equal access to the training program?
And so this is really part 1 of the ADA, which just says you have to provide somebody who's qualified. And that's where the majority of these are going to hinge, where in UME, the fact that you were admitted to the school is going to you're going to have an assumption that you are a qualified learner, right? Where in GME, there's going to be an argument about whether or not you're qualified for the job. And if you are qualified for the job, then it goes to reasonable accommodation, which is, as Dina pointed out, a lower threshold, or a higher threshold, sorry, than UME. So you're less likely to get as many accommodations at the employment level. But you are required still to go through that interactive process. One thing that is very different about Title I and Title II that you need to consider, because again, in really supporting your learner, is this idea in GME or in employment law of the person that is coming to the institution and asking for an accommodation or disclosing a disability they have to do the ask. There is no requirement for the employer to come up with an accommodation plan. So it's very transactional, where we provide a lot more support and we are creative and kind of thinking about what accommodations may be helpful. There is zero requirement for an HR specialist to know anything about clinical accommodations. In fact, they are very, very, very highly likely not to know anything about clinical accommodations. And their job really is to collect the ask, but the ask has to be codified. And then they go to the program director and say, is this reasonable? And the program director basically says yes or no. And then you can appeal, but if you are, the onus is on the employee or the trainee to ask. And that is big, especially when you don't know. And if you've had a really good DRP in undergraduate medical education, you may be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, like they helped me figure everything out. I don't know what I need in this setting. So that's an area where you can really, really help move your trainee along in the process by helping them come up with something and put it in writing, so that they go in and they know exactly what to ask for.
Hello?
And if you happen to know that it's in practice at another training site, then you can say that, you can have them write it out and then say, oh, the University of Texas Galveston has done this before, if you want to talk to their program director, or, whatever school. And when program directors have done it, they're not afraid of it anymore. So usually they'll be willing to talk to other schools. I've learned so much from program directors. What they'll say, oh, the ones that do the accommodations that are more progressive are like, it wasn't a big deal. And even if they were scared at first, they're not scared anymore. And so that is definitely a trusted source to help you break down the barrier of fear.
Sometimes the scariest part's just before you ask, but you're thinking about asking.
Yep.
Okay, that was really helpful. Okay, so I want to show here the book club website so that you all can see the link to the book club and see that the next session is a student with a service animal on April 13th with Jennifer Gossett and Linda Sullivan. It's 3:30 to 5 Eastern Standard, just like this one. The book, as Lisa mentioned, you might be able to access it from your library. But it is also nice to have this little hard copy that I've all the books, I always underline, highlight, fold things, stick sticky things on them.
And new books coming out soon. If you can't find that at your library and you can't afford it, email me. Oops. And I will find a way to get it to you.
Okay. And I think we'll open it up to questions, but this is where we will stop recording.
Yep.
Who does that?